Bibliophiles of the internet, I'm Adri, and today I'm here to recommend some nonfiction books. I thought this would be a good video to make because as of filming this, it's November, which is usually nonfiction November, so if you need some recommendations for that or for any other time of the year, here's a cool little collection of nonfiction books all in one place. Let me preface this by saying that nonfiction is such a broad categorization. I actually studied some nonfiction in college, so I've read everything from academic and scientific nonfiction to instructional nonfiction, memoir, creative nonfiction. I've run the whole gamut, but these are just some of my favorites. So I'm gonna start with some indigenous nonfiction because it's also Indigathon as I'm filming this, and any of these should help you fulfill the nonfiction reading prompt. First up is Bad Indians, a memoir by Deborah A. Miranda. Deborah A. Miranda is a registered member of the Ohlone, Costanoan Esselen Nation here in California. She's queer, a writer, and actually primarily a poet. This memoir is really fascinating because it takes a very broad approach to not only exploring her personal history, but the collective history of her people. So it actually goes back to documenting the enslavement of Native peoples by missionaries and then progresses forward from that point. It's sort of structured like a funnel in that way, where it begins with a lot of history and research and then becomes much more specific to her own lived experience. In essence, the memoir actually transitions from more academic-focused nonfiction to personal memoir, and then transitions again towards the end to oral history as a way to frame the future for both her people and herself. The book is interspersed with documents and newspaper clippings as well as songs and poems. It's such a powerful and unique memoir, and I've never read anything else quite like it. Next, of course, I have to recommend Braiding Sweetgrass by Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer. This is a nature memoir of sorts exploring Dr. Kimmerer's background as a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and also a scientist. More specifically, she's a botanist, and she takes this book as an opportunity to share all the different meanings, functions, and uses of plants. And not only does she go into the science behind those plants, but she also explores how they're connected to her personal and cultural history, and she looks at them through a lens of spirituality and mindfulness. This is far and away one of the most beautiful and valuable memoirs I've ever read. It's deeply personal and heartfelt. It comes from such a place of connectedness, but it also challenges you to think about climate change, the market economy, and how we can redefine our own relationships with natural resources. If you only read one book from this list, it should be this one, and if you're able to access it, I highly recommend the audiobook. I'm also currently listening to this author's other book, Gathering Moss, which is exactly what it sounds like. If you had told me this time last year that I would willingly be reading a piece of scientific nonfiction about moss, I don't think I would have believed you, but this definitely has a similar vibe to Braiding Sweetgrass, except it's much more focused on one very specific plant. I'm learning more about moss than I ever have before in my life, but there's also something so tender and personal about it that this author does so incredibly well, and she really unveils what this slow-moving, slow-growing organism has to teach us. The last Indigenous memoir I'm recommending for today is A History of My Brief Body by Billy Ray Belcourt. Billy Ray Belcourt is a queer Indigenous writer belonging to the Driftpile First Nation in Canada, and this memoir is all about his experiences existing at the intersection of queerness, indigeneity, joy, grief, love, and loss. I've said this before, but Billy Ray Belcourt is also a poet, and that really comes through in how intentional his writing feels on the page, and how he works and reworks language in really thoughtful and surprising ways. This memoir is powerful in its honesty and its commitment to honoring both Indigenous joy and Indigenous grief, which all too often are forced to coexist. It's about confronting and reckoning with the trauma of the past, refusing to turn away from the injustices of the present, and daring to imagine a future where Indigenous people are invited to exist as never before. I definitely recommend it. Next, I'm going to recommend some informative nonfiction, meaning that while there may be some personal aspects to it, it's first and foremost based on research and qualified testimonies, and the first of those I'm going to recommend is Ace by Angela Chen. Angela Chen is an Asian American queer asexual journalist, and this book is a deep dive on understanding asexuality and exploring how compulsory sexuality and allonormativity not only harms asexual people, but also drastically limits all of us. Like I said, this author is a journalist, and she brings that background into how this book is structured by pulling from a ton of research and resources. And even though it's not perfect, this book is also incredibly intersectional and explores how our experiences of gender, sexuality, culture, disability, and mental health can impact our experience and understanding of aceness. It's very much written from a perspective of liberation, with the goal of arming people with the knowledge and information they need in order to understand all of their choices, including the choice to not make a choice. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory by Caitlin Doughty. Caitlin Doughty is passionate about death positivity. She has experience as a professional mortician, and she's studied death and death practices from around the world for many, many years. This book definitely leans towards memoir because it's about how she got into the death industry, what she had to learn to be a mortician, the biological processes behind death and body preservation, but again, it's eye-opening and deeply informative because of her knowledge and her experience. Caitlin's work is also really incredible because she's so passionate about destigmatizing death, challenging the death industry, and reminding us of how there is validity and importance to every kind of death practice. On that note, I also have to recommend her second book, From Here to Eternity: Traveling the World to Find the Good Death. Just like her first book, this one is heavily based in academia, research, and testimony, but it also pulls from Caitlin's own travels across the world as she observes and learns about death practices across cultures. This book is essential in challenging the dominance of Western beliefs and practices, especially when it comes to how we contextualize and understand death itself, but it's also a direct challenge to the commercialization of the death industry in the US. Again, what I really appreciate about Caitlin's work is that not only is she destigmatizing our relationship with death and dead bodies, but she also understands how there is dignity, beauty, and importance in every way that humans engage with death across the world. This next book is sort of straddling a few different lines, but I think this category also applies to Disability Visibility, edited by Alice Wong. It's an anthology of essays and testimonies written by disabled creators about their personal experience with disability, and I think it's a great starting point for those who want to understand more about the diverse experiences of disabled peoples and also the need for disability justice. Not only is this book well-researched and well-organized, but it leads by example in how brilliantly it makes space for its contributors. Each essay is unique in form and content because each writer has the freedom to approach this topic from whatever lens makes the most sense for them, which is how they're able to show how disability, in the way that we understand and frame it, can never be a monolithic experience. This book is also essential in how it proves that all social justice movements are tied to and should be predicated on disability justice. And lastly, for this category, I have to mention Bad Blood by John Carreyrou. This is a mixture of journalism, business nonfiction, and true crime. It's the definitive expose about Elizabeth Holmes and her very not real company known as Theranos. If you've never heard about this, I'm so sorry. There's no great or concise way to explain it, so just strap in. Basically, Holmes wanted to be like the next Steve Jobs, and she created a startup called Theranos and proposed this technology that would make blood testing simple, comprehensive, and painless. And she got a ton of investment for it, but the technology didn't and actually couldn't exist. John Carreyrou is the journalist who actually broke the story, and the book catalogs this deeply elaborate corporate fraud from the inside, and it's bizarre and disturbing to say the very least. I had to include this book because it opened my eyes even further to the corruption enabled by our capitalistic system, and it reveals some very serious flaws in our society, our government, and our economy in a way that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. And I also have to give this book props for the way it made me want to immerse myself in more research about this case. I looked up articles that were cited in the book, I watched interviews and documentaries, I listened to podcasts, and I think that's noteworthy because for me personally, it's rare for nonfiction to inspire that kind of response. The last category I'm going to tackle for today is memoir, and again, this next book is straddling a few different categories, but I absolutely have to mention Sorted by Jackson Bird. Jackson Bird is a trans YouTuber, activist, and writer. As a YouTuber, he specialized in making informative and thoughtful videos about the queer experience and queer history, and also recording his own transition. This memoir basically follows his process of coming out and understanding himself as trans. If you are transmasc, or if you know someone who's transmasc and there are people in your life who are struggling to understand it, give them this book. It is such an informative and comprehensive starting point that makes a world of a difference. That's why I love this memoir so much. It's a deeply emotional and personal look into Jackson's own experiences, revelations, and milestones, but it also compiles definitions, guides, and other helpful resources. This memoir isn't meant to teach you about the trans experience, and of course there are things it can never really address because Jackson is a white American trans man, but rather it's to let you into one person's experience of being trans, while also opening so many other doors to trans media and resources that you can engage with long after you finish the book. I also have to recommend My Time Among the Whites, Notes from an Unfinished Education by Janine Capó Cruzet. This is a collection of personal essays in which the author details her experience of growing up in America as the daughter of Cuban refugees, and also how her Latina identity has been shaped by the overwhelming dominance of whiteness. It's just an incredible collection of essays from top to bottom. Cruzet really understands how every interaction and experience in America becomes a fraught and sometimes traumatizing exercise in transcribing and navigating whiteness. The essays in this book are also great about exploring how marginalized and BIPOC folks are expected to mold our identities to fit whiteness, and how we're then often left to our own devices when it comes to deciphering and deconstructing that whiteness. And it's also about Cruzet sharing her own exhaustion that stems from having to adhere to whiteness while also being expected to subvert it as a Latina person all at once. I could recommend so many more, but the last memoir I'm going to recommend for today is How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones. Saeed Jones is a Black queer poet, so this definitely reads as a blend of poetry and prose. It's about his experience growing up as a queer Black boy in the South and all the different ways he's fought to claim his space and identity throughout that process. Whether it's in his family, his culture, his religion, his education, his workplace, this memoir is dedicated to unpacking how his queerness intersects with those spaces and experiences. This is one of the most beautiful and vulnerable memoirs I've ever read. It's about painstakingly growing into the person you were always meant to be when the world is constantly trying to tell you that your very existence is a death sentence. And I think it's so incredibly valuable in how it explores ideas of power dynamics, performativity, and how we gauge authenticity in relationship to queerness. It's emotional, it's painful, it's honest, and it's also deeply cathartic. This is definitely worth the read if you haven't had a chance to pick it up yet. So those are just a few nonfiction books that I would definitely recommend. I could have also mentioned All Boys Aren't Blue, The Undocumented Americans, In the Dream House, Hola Papi, and so many more, but I would love it if you left a comment down below telling me about your favorite nonfiction books. But that's everything I had to recommend for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.